Hello dear learners, welcome to this SWAYAM NPTEL online course on inclusive education. I am Dr. Umakant Prasad, an assistant professor from Department of Education, Vishwabharati Shantiniketan. This is week 7 and today we are going to discuss lecture number 33, that is National Policies on Education and Inclusive Education. During this lecture, we will discuss recommendations of the following policies on inclusive education, that is the National Policy on Education 1968, the National Policy on Education 1986, National Policy on Education Review Committee, that is NPERC or Acharya Ramamurthy Committee report 1990 and the Program of Action 1992. The development of India's education policies shows how the country gradually moved towards including children with disabilities in mainstream education. Starting with the National Policy on Education 1968, the focus was on providing equal opportunities to all, but with an integrated model where children had to adjust to regular schools. The National Policy on Education 1986 presented a more comprehensive and progressive approach by stressing on integration, teacher training, support services and accessible infrastructure. Later, the Acharya Ramamurthy Committee 1990 and the Program of Action 1992 highlighted the need for change. Let us discuss the recommendations of these policies one by one. National Policy on Education 1968. The National Policy on Education 1968 was the first comprehensive education policy framed in independent India. It was largely based on the recommendations of the Kothari Commission 1964-66. The policy aimed to promote national progress, cultural unity and a sense of common citizenship. It strongly emphasized equal access to education for all children regardless of their caste, religion or gender, etc. A central goal was to remove disparities and extend educational opportunities to disadvantaged groups such as scheduled castes, scheduled tribes and girls. Although the term inclusive education was not widely used at the time, the policy carried the spirit of inclusion by highlighting the need to bring marginalized groups into the mainstream education system. Approach to children with disabilities. One of the significant objectives of the policy was to integrate children with physical and mental disabilities into the general community as equal members. However, the model which was supported by this policy was more of an integrated approach than an inclusive one. Children with disabilities were expected to be prepared. Children with disabilities were expected to be prepared to study in regular schools rather than schools adapting to meet their needs. The frequent use of the term handicapped showed that the focus was on the impairment itself instead of recognizing the child hostility. Following the Kothari Commission, efforts were made to place children with disabilities in regular schools, but this was done through preparatory integrated programs rather than transforming schools into truly inclusive space. It is important to note that at the time, even at the international level, the idea of inclusive schools had not yet fully developed. With regard to inclusive education, the policy recommended expansion of educational facilities for children with disabilities to prevent exclusion, establishment of special schools wherever necessary, encouragement of integration into regular schools whenever possible. Now, let us discuss the National Policy on Education 1986. The National Policy on Education 1986 is a significant shift in India's approach to educating students with disabilities. Moving beyond the Mudaliar Commission's focus on segregated special schools, the National Policy on Education 1986 introduced a more progressive framework centered on integrated education. The National Policy on Education 1986 laid down a number of specific points to promote the integration of students with disabilities into mainstream schooling. These provisions aim to address both the physical and pedagogical barriers that existed in the education system. The National Policy on Education 1986 was revised policy on the basis of previous policies that was in 1968, and a special section was included in its article 4.9 titled The Handicapped. The section clearly recommended the need to integrate the physically and mentally handicapped with the general community as equal partners. The overall idea was to prepare them for normal growth and to enable them to face life with courage and confidence. Some measures suggested by the policies were integration as the primary goal. The policy's central focus was to integrate children with mild to moderate disabilities into regular schools. The goal was to prepare them to become equal partners in society. With special schools were still recognized for students with severe disabilities, the emphasis shifted to making regular schools the primary setting for a majority of disabled children. Support services. To facilitate integration, the National Policy on Education 1986 mandated the provision of various support services. This included things like financial assistance for students, providing assistive devices like hearing aids and braille books, and ensuring the availability of transportation allowance and other allowance to help families bear the costs of education. Teacher training and sensitization. A crucial component of the policy was the need to reorient the teaching community. The National Policy on Education 1986 emphasized training general school teachers to handle the needs of students with disabilities within the regular classrooms. It also called for the appointment of a special educator and the creation of resource rooms to provide additional support to these students and their teachers. Removal of architectural barriers. The policy acknowledged the need for accessible infrastructure. It called for the removal of architectural barriers in schools to ensure that students with physical disabilities could easily access classrooms, libraries, laboratories and toilets. Vocational and professional training. The National Policy on Education 1986 recognized the importance of providing vocational training to students with disabilities. The aim was to equip them with skills for self-reliance and employment, thereby fostering their economic and social independence. Let us discuss the National Policy on Education Review Committee or Acharya Ramamurthy Committee report 1990. To review the implementation of various aspects of the National Policy on Education 1986, a review committee was appointed by the central government under the chairmanship of Acharya Ramamurthy. The report of the Committee for Review of the National Policy on Education 1986 had the following observations and suggestions. It found that National Policy on Education was not inclined towards changing the overall general education for education of children with disabilities. It found that the recommendations of the policy led to isolation of the special schools. It suggests that the primary aim of education should be to build an enlightened and a human society. The committee recommended programs for all disadvantaged groups especially scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, women, educationally backward minorities and the handicapped. It emphasized that the specific factors that hindered accessibility, affordability and accessibility of educational programs for disadvantaged groups must be identified. Thus, we can say that the National Policy on Education Review Committee was more inclined towards the inclusive approach of education, quite similar to Kothari Commission, which to expected education to be process that enables all individuals to realize their potentialities. Let us discuss the Program of Action 1992. The Program of Action 1992 was created to implement the National Policy on Education 1986. It included a major section on education in special schools. This showed that the focus was more on building special schools for children with disabilities rather than making regular schools inclusive. The Program of Action suggested that children with disabilities should study in regular schools. However, it required them to first be trained in special schools. These schools were meant to prepare children by teaching them life skills, communication and basic academic skills, and only after gaining these abilities were children shifted to regular schools. The Program of Action also introduced the idea of composite school, special schools. The Program of Action also introduced the idea of composite special schools. In such schools, children with different disabilities studied in different departments or classrooms. Overall, the Program of Action focused on opening more special schools instead of improving regular schools. In the same year, the Parliament passed the Rehabilitation Council of India Act to monitor and to standardize training courses for 16 categories of professionals in special education and rehabilitation. In conclusion, we can say the development of India's education policies between 1968 and 1992 shows a gradual but important development in the approach to educating children with disabilities. The National Policy on Education 1968 promoted access and integration, but followed by a medical model, expecting children to be ready for regular schools. The National Policy on Education 1986 brought a more progressive vision highlighting integration, teacher training, support services, accessibility and vocational preparation. However, its implementation was uneven, as noted by the Acharya Ramamurthy Committee 1990, which criticized the continued isolation of special schools and called for a truly inclusive approach. The Program of Action 1992 reinforced special schools, but introduced preparatory and composite models. Overall, these policies are considered significant steps for inclusive education in India, but the journey reveals a struggle between segregated, integrated and inclusive approaches that continues to shape educational reforms today. There are some references here. Thank you.